And so welcome everybody to our second session as we delve into the guide of the Perplexed. Last week, what we did is we talked about this greater issues and the development of Jewish philosophy, some of the background of Maimonides' life and the development of the guide. And we read the epistle, the very beginning of the guide, the first letter, where Maimonides states his intention as to writing the guide, which he says, though some scholars don't believe him, that was meant for one student. Some scholars believed he was covering his back so that nobody would think that he was trying to reveal what he shouldn't be revealing. But in essence, he presents the whole of the guide as a letter to a student who he deems worthy of receiving these truths. So first I wanted to ask if anybody has any questions that were still in their minds from last week. If not, my plan for today is to talk a little bit more about the context of the guide, and then what happened to the guide as it emerged, as it was received in the Jewish world or not. And in particular, I want to talk about a few different commentaries on the guide because the guide was so influential. The commentaries come up. We're going to read a little bit, and then we're going to start to read the preface, the beginning of the guide, which has been called the foundation of Jewish philosophy from this point onwards, because it's so influential in how it lays out basic ideas. So first, does anybody have any remaining thoughts or questions from last week?
Well, the only thing I have to say is I did start reading it to prepare for today, and it is definitely not light reading.
It's written in a dense way, but if you read it slowly and a few times, then you can usually get to it. But I will say that Maimonides himself at a certain point says, you know, when you read my work, read it very carefully because not one word has not been thought out. So that he puts such thought into the guide, and he's also writing in a philosophic way, which is a whole tradition, which makes it at times dense. But what we're going to be doing is the preface is less dense in other parts in many ways, and then I'm going to be picking different sections which relate easier to us, and which at least I'm really interested in. I think everybody, you can read the guide in so many ways, and so we're going to be taking a certain direction, and at least my plan is to avoid some of the most dense philosophic parts. Maybe we'll try one or two, but just because they're written within such a particular context that they're not quite as relatable. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit more and give you just a sense of the context of what happened when the guide was released and published. And so there were obviously those in the Jewish world who looked at the guide and saw what it was and were very uncomfortable with it because it was putting up philosophy and seemingly not as focused on the tradition, and were even, right, copies of the guide were burnt right around the Jewish world. They burned Maimonides' work because they were unhappy with it. But then there were those who so were caught up in the world of the guide that it almost became like a second Torah. And the guide became like the foundation of these communities that were philosophical, religious Jewish communities, especially in Spain and southern France and Italy. And the guide was so influential that every week the rabbis in those communities would give their weekly sermon with the guide, as in only interpreting the Torah as per the guide. And this went on for endless decades. That's how influential. And people would write letters back to each other, you know, what was the guide really about? And there's a whole literature on that. And then there were many commentaries written on the guide to begin to teach people what the guide was actually meaning. And people believe that reading the guide itself, David was talking about this a little bit last week. For those of you who are new, David class, a member here has spent many decades reading the guide, but he was talking about how he feels that just reading the guide itself is almost a philosophic or spiritual practice, however you want to do it, and using the active intellect. So people truly felt that reading the guide had a redeeming quality to it, that just by reading it, you were raising your intellectual mind and kind of apprehending, in some ways similar to studying Talmud, but different. This is more philosophic, a little bit more up in the ether, as they say. But at the same time, the same as we have a trouble with translating the guide. So what do? We use what's considered now to be the definitive translation at the moment by Shlomo Pinas, the Guide of the Perplexed. Well, a lot of these communities were not in Arabic-speaking lands, and the Arabic copy of the guide was not available very easily. So they were reading a translation into Hebrew by Ibn Tibbon, Samuel Ibn Tibbon. And whenever you have a translation, you also have an interpretation, right? We know this. Any translation is interpretation. And Ibn Tibbon was a philosopher who was of the bent of, he liked to reveal things a little bit more than Maimonides did. And he himself stated this, that Maimonides, as we'll keep talking, wanted to obscure things deliberately. And Ibn Tibbon, he was a little bit on the other side. He wanted to reveal, he has this image of revealing more of the light. It's almost like a hole. So it's like how much of it is illuminated and how much is in the dark. And he says he wanted to open up the hole so the more people can see it. But it was so influential that there were dictionaries written about the guide. There was poetry written about the guide. It was just a whole movement that came up out of the guide.
Rabbi, how was it possible that it was so widely read when I mean, this is before the printing press?
That's true.
And yet there are all these copies and translations and dictionaries. So there were scribes. I mean, must have been a huge industry of getting the word out.
So it's a really good question. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, obviously there was no printing press, and there were many scribes in the Islamic world. It was a very literate world where scribes were making copies of books. Again, when we're saying widely spread, we're not talking anywhere near our time's worth of volume. We're not, this is not a machzor for every Jew in the pew kind of thing. We're talking about, a few copies in the hands of rabbis and of scholars or wealthy Jews who are then talking about it or sharing it with others. I remember once studying a little bit of, this is a later time, and on the other side of the world, more around Greece and Turkey, how people have done studies, how books, because you can trace how books were spread, because the way it would happen, and this is again a little bit later and more in the side of Turkey and in Greece, and if there was a Jewish book, for example, that people really liked, and someone would come with the book into a harbor, and other people would say, this is a great book. Can I borrow your book? I'm going to take it to a scribe who's going to copy it and make a few copies before you leave the harbor with your book. So then the way it's easy to trace all these copies is because there's always a few errors. What scribe is 100% correct. So you can actually trace all these books and which editions and versions of the book make their way around from all of these different times it was copied by scribes. Because again, you didn't have a master plate, you didn't have, so that there's a whole science in that in itself, which is super interesting. And so actually, the way it's described these days by scholars is that this whole movement of following the guide is not just following Maimonides, but it's following Tibbon's translation. It's almost Maimonidean, Tibbonian movement because of his translation and the introduction to his translation, which were so important. So in all these places, if any Jew was studying philosophy, you would have philosophy on one side and the guide on the other, and that was how important it was. And there were all of these early commentaries on it. And the early commentaries were all positive. Later in the Middle Ages, there was a more of a backlash where people started to write commentaries challenging Maimonides and challenging especially his most unorthodox comments and interpretations. One of the Abarbanels, the Abarbanel was a great family of Portuguese and Spanish intellectuals, and one of them, Isaac Abarbanel, writes something, a commentary in the guide, which isn't completely positive because he's challenging a lot of what Maimonides is saying from the point of it not being traditional enough. But the early commentaries are all very, very positive. And I'm going to show you a little bit of how to show you their mindset. So one of the most important ones was by a rabbi called Moses de Narbonne. This one is dear to my heart because Narbonne is only about an hour away from where I spent many years growing up in France. Now it's a small town with absolutely probably no more than a handful of Jews. But at a certain point, it was a center of learning in southern France next to the border in French Catalonia. Moses de Narbonne was actually born in Perpignan, which was the nearest city to where I grew up. Again, this is on the border with Spain, a town, now a city of 100,000 Jews, mainly Ashkenaz, mainly Sephardic now. And Nancy was asking about the Ashkenazi Sephardic differences. So, right, Spain was Sephardic at this moment. Obviously, the Muslim world was Sephardic, or what would become Sephardic. Ashkenaz was northern, eastern France and Germany and all the rest of Europe. Italy was Sephardic. But there was this area in southern France, which was kind of a mixture of the two, which was called Provence. Provence, now we think of the eastern part of southern France, but then there was also the western part of southern France, at least when you think about it Jewishly. And this was like a meeting ground of Ashkenazi and Sephardic culture. So it was it was a very fertile area. It's where Kabbalah eventually rose up and a lot of this philosophy stuff. So Moses de Narbonne, he wrote a commentary where he was, we're going to read a little section from what he wrote, but he was really interested in revealing everything that Maimonides said, I don't want to reveal this because there's too many ignorant people. It's too dangerous. But Moses de Narbonne, he had no problem with revealing some of it. So we're going to now go and read a little bit of some of what Moses de Narbonne says. Okay. And then we're going to get back. Let's see. Source guide. Okay. Would someone like to read this? Alan, how about you start? You're muted, by the way.
Okay, Moses de Narbonne. As we have seen, the high station of this book, it is as a candle illuminating all darkness, to the extent that it is like the true form of the Torah. As it is said about the law, the Lord is perfect, converting the soul to its foundation and its principle. As it includes in the perfection of the soul the two parts mentioned earlier regarding ethics and intellect. But we have seen that most benefits of the book, especially among those that are precious and wondrous, are lacking from us, just as the sages are lacking from us due to our sins of negligence and insufficiency of effort. That constitutes a disgrace to science within the nation and a disgrace to both common people and eminent persons in disseminating foolishness and the absence of truth. In relation to this is the length and force of the exile, as well as the force of tragedy and hardship. The spirit of generosity has animated my spirit to widen and fill in the openings of the filigree of silver and to interpret this wondrous divine book. Furthermore, in some places I will point to the philosophical disagreements therein.
Let's stop just for 1 second. So what he's saying, first of all, the way he's talking about it, he's saying the Maimonides guide is the true form of the Torah. That is first of all, some people would call that heresy to say that the Torah, you can't get the true form of the Torah just by reading the Torah itself. So he's calling Maimonides' book the true form of the Torah. And then one of the ideas I find so very interesting here is that he's saying that we're not able to really see that true Torah because of everything, partly because of negligence and the absence of truth and foolishness, but also because of the exile and the force of tragedy and hardship. But this is a very powerful idea within our tradition, which is that we had these ideas which maybe were all the true form of the Torah, right? Going all the way back to biblical secrets that the prophets had, but that they were lost or difficult to come through because when you're in exile, what are you doing? You're just surviving. You're Tevye and the Fiddler on the Roof. You're just trying to survive, and who has time for this, right? So some of these rabbis really felt that these truths were truths that had been lost or that weren't spoken, but that now Maimonides was opening up this vision of the Torah, which was its true meaning. And I love how he says, the spirit of generosity has animated my spirit, i.e., I'm feeling so generous. I'm going to let you know a little bit of what this is talking about and interpret this wondrous divine book. So go ahead, Alan, just finish this last section.
In fact, most of his secrets are already known through general books of science, since they provide a foundation for him. Although he perfects them and first drew our attention to them, it is proper to turn to the preliminary cause, and all the more so when it dates from the time of my youth. For my father raised me from my youth on the knowledge of this cause.
Mm-hmm. So what this is saying, right? This is his way of justifying why he's revealing some of the secrets that Maimonides himself is maybe not revealing. And he's saying, well, all of these secrets are somewhat already are out there, though Maimonides perfects them and he draws the Jewish world's attention to them, perhaps. And then this time of my youth, right? For my father raised me. So Moses de Narbonne's father raised him with these secrets, right? In Perpignan, this little city in the south of France. And I've shared the story before with the group. But so when I was growing up, I lived in Jerusalem until I was 7. Then we moved to this little area of France. When I was growing up, at a certain point, my arts teacher at school came up to me and he said, well, isn't your father a rabbi? And I said, sure, my father is a rabbi. He said, well, we were renovating. He lived in a town that was from the 1100s. And he says, we were renovating our wall. We came across Hebrew documents in the wall. We wanted to find out what they were. And he'd come across the Geniza with papers from a student of Maimonides. And so he showed them to my father, and my father told him what they were, and he sent them to a museum. So there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of interesting sharings back then. It was a very fertile Jewish area. Now it's not so much. I remember when we were growing up there, every now and then we wore a kippah at the beginning before it got dangerous to do so. But every now and then someone would come up to you while you were on the street and whisper the Shema in your ear and then walk away. And you go, what was that about? Here again, he's trying to justify what he's doing, which is revealing these secrets that Maimonides doesn't. And part of that is, like I said, Narbonne, his view, Moses of Narbonne, but also Ibn Tibbon, who translated it, because he had this view which was really interesting, and I think many of us can relate to, where he says, well, Jewish history isn't as the sages often make it out to be, which is history is going downhill. That's a traditional view of Jewish history, because Sinai was the highest moment, and since then we're going down in holiness. It's called Yeridat Hadorot. We're going down in holiness. But he actually, they were among the philosophers, and Ibn Tibbon, who translated the guide, and others believed it. He felt it was the opposite, that as people are evolving their intellectual abilities, more and more of the Torah can be revealed. So Moses de Narbonne is coming a few centuries after the guide, think, well, I can reveal more of the secrets since we've evolved since the time of Maimonides.
Rabbi, let me say something about these secrets. First of all, Maimonides himself claims that most of these things really cannot be revealed or cannot be told, not only because in the Sefer Hagigah and lots of other places they say not to do it, but these are of the nature that you can understand these things at one moment and then stop understanding them the next. You can understand them and want to explain them to somebody, but don't have the words to do it. So these are not just normal secrets like Jimmy's having an affair with Sally kind of secrets. These are secrets that have something to do with the nature of the thing that's secret. The nature of the thing that's secret is maybe participates a little bit in the infinite, or participates in some sort of a form that you're speaking of it, is going to be very, very difficult. When Maimonides claims this, it isn't just that these are secrets that you could tell somebody and then they'd all be out. Okay, it's not that kind of a secret. And he mentions that in the guide in a certain place.
Right. No, I think, and thanks for bringing that up. It's very true. These aren't just secrets that you could just sit down and tell somebody and suddenly they would have the secret. They're all about catching a glimpse. He talks about this a lot, right? You're catching a glimpse of a truth. And he actually says that that's what he writes. He wrote the guide for people who might catch a glimpse of the truth and then be disturbed by it because it goes against what the simple meaning of the Torah might be, and then they're perplexed, they're confused because they've catched a glimpse of it. And he actually writes it to give them a few more steps. I'm going to reveal to you a few more steps, but I'm not going to say outright what it actually is trying to say, because you might not even be able to understand it. And he says, I mean, this is probably a medieval sensibility, but only 1 in 10,000 of the vulgar people could ever understand all of this. And this goes on about only the elite and those who have the ability could understand it. And those who have this sense of a dissonance between philosophy and between their Jewish heritage. And that's why he says, I am purposefully only going to give you incomplete interpretations, because if you're smart enough, if you really have that glimpse, as David was talking about, the rest will become clear to you. And if you don't have it, it will just whoosh right by you and you won't.
And the image of the filigree of silver is also something that Maimonides uses in the Guide for the Perplexed in the introduction. And that is that he's talking about something that's covered with silver, which is a precious element, but not so precious. And inside the silver is something of gold. So, that's where that image is coming from.
Yeah. The inside is gold if you can but see it. And that's kind of like his, the lens. And maybe to kind of conclude, and then we can start looking at the preface, wanted to just bring up one way that I think this relates well to where we are in history, and maybe to conservative Judaism too, which is really what Maimonides is saying throughout the guide is, I want to have intellectual honesty in how I approach my Judaism, right? I can't live in a world where I have self-contained one world, which is my Jewish world, and have a world of what I'm learning through science, whether it's what we call these days science or philosophy. I've got to harmonize them. I've got to bring intellectual honesty into my Judaism. And that's how conservative Judaism, right, began, because people said, I've got to bring a modern way of looking at religion to Judaism, and I can't compartmentalize how I look at my Judaism. The world is 5,000 years old, and what I'm learning from science. So Maimonides is really doing something that's been done throughout the ages, and which ends up being beneficial to both Judaism and also sometimes to the outside world. And So, Maimonides' guide to finish the thread of all the commentaries, Maimonides' guide finds new life at different points in history. One of them is during the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, because people really related to what he was trying to do, which was harmonize science and Judaism. And the last commentary on the guide is in the 1800s by an early thinker of the Jewish Enlightenment, who really loved this idea of bringing a kind of rational Judaism. It's also why some conservative thinkers kind of want to claim Maimonides as the first conservative Jew, though I'm never sure if I would totally agree with that. But let's before we begin, I want to read one more commentary, and it's really interesting. All these commentaries on the guide, and I'm definitely open up to any questions anybody has. That they're all working again within this paradigm of how much to reveal or not to reveal. And so there's one really interesting comment of someone who looks back at the four commentaries and judges them as the four sons. And he says, well, Moses de Narbonne's commentary is actually the evil son because he reveals everything. And then the Shem Tov, who gives a more traditional, from the point of view of the traditions interpretation of the guide, is like the good son because he's taking it all from the point of view of what the tradition of how to look at the guide as illuminating your traditional view of Judaism, not too radical. So we're going to conclude my little lecture with looking at one more text by the Shem Tov. This is another commentator. And then we will study. We'll begin the preface itself. Okay. Somebody'd like to read for here. Deb, how about you?
Okay, and where am I starting? Shem Tov ben Joseph?
Yeah, this method.
Number
Yeah.
2?
Yeah.
Okay. This method was sought by important and eminent scholars of Torah who were pious of the Most High, to listen to all matters of science that they apprehended by intellectual investigation and which were not contrary to tradition. It is said further, Rabbi Meir found a pomegranate. He ate it, within it, and the peel he threw away. In this manner, the sages likened worthy subjects to the core of a pomegranate, which is nourishment for the soul and from which the soul derives enjoyment. Intellectual matters were likened to the nectar of a pomegranate, as it is said, I would cause thee to drink from spiced wine of the juice of my pomegranate. They likened matters that are worthless and that should not be accepted to the peel of a pomegranate, which is fit only to be thrown away. However, it is imperative to warn an individual and make known to him that not everyone is suitable for learning matters through investigation. Rather, they are meant for those whose nature is pure, who have sense and understand the written Torah and the words of the sages, who received its interpretation, and therefore learned the sciences that are a preparation for the ultimate science.
That's a good metaphor for how it was seen. He's the more traditional commentator, right? He's saying, not everybody can drink the nectar of the pomegranate. Again, it's that image of the filigree. Inside, there's what's most worthy, right? And but not everybody can totally get it. And I wanted to bring this last text by his. Deb, go ahead, and then we're going to start to learn.
I have written about the texts of philosophers who speak on these matters and on Ibn Rushd's opinion, because it appears from his words that he tends toward the opinion of our sages. Rushd, how do I say that?
Ibn Rushd, yeah.
Rushd said, nobody doubts that among the Israelites there were many learned men, and this is apparent from the books which were found among the Israelites and which are attributed to Solomon. And never has wisdom ceased among the inspired, i.e. the prophets. And it is therefore the truest of all sayings that every prophet is a sage, but not every sage is a prophet. According to Rushd, Plato said, one of the Jews who engages in metaphysics came to me, and as soon as he began to speak, I realized I had never seen anything greater. As we entered into divine science and the subject of union with the active intellect, I saw something that summoned me. My ultimate goal was to understand some of what he spoke, and I knew that this was above the level of humans. It is clear that our sages, and all the more so the prophets, who grasp the secret of God, apprehended from among the divine secrets how God brought into existence created things and how he governs of the universe, which no scholar can apprehend through investigation.
So I find that so interesting, right? That quote from Plato. This is Plato saying that he once encountered a Jew who taught him these incredible, or who apprehended this incredible philosophical, here it sounds mystical, right? Almost in some ways using philosophic language. And so what the Shem Tov is saying is that back in the days of Plato, there were Jews who did this. Maybe they used different language, the prophets, right? But maybe they used different language than the philosophers, but they were apprehending these truths. And so what he's saying is that these truths have always been part of a Jewish tradition, just maybe we've lost touch with them or they haven't been revealed. And these are the truths of the prophets. And so this is in some ways what draws me the most to the guide of the Perplexed, which is it's trying to look at matters of how God governs the universe, or spiritual matters, or theological matters, and trying to look at it scientifically, trying to bring order to it. It's not just some mysterious thing, but there's actually an order to how it works. That's a radical approach to metaphysics, and I think it's very powerful in our time too, to bring a sense of scientific understanding to religion as well, and that science and religion don't have to be separate. So let's stop sharing this. Anybody have any questions or thoughts before we move on to the next, before we look at the preface? Okay. So
You're muted, Nancy.
Nancy, you're muted.
Oh.
Thank you. I've got a question about a clarification of a term. When the medieval sages say science, do they mean science as we understand it today, or do they mean philosophy as the ultimate science? What do they mean by science?
It's a really good, yes, it's a really good question. And it's right. So back then philosophy included both the natural sciences and other, right? It was everything. And, Galileo was both, we think of him as a scientist, but he was in his times understanding also a philosopher, right? Because they were natural, right? It's natural philosophy. And right, in our days, there are many people who think that we've separated too much philosophy and what we now call science, because philosophy is just trying to understand within a greater lens how it all fits together. But I'm not a student of philosophy, so I'm a layperson in that area, but that's how I look at it. So I think when they're saying science, they're looking to some degree, it's a Greek way of a Greek methodology of understanding reality, so you can apply that methodology to the law, you can apply it to the physical world, you can apply it to the divine world, right? And so those are the different sciences. Okay. So now let us turn to the beginning of the preface. We're going to not get too far today, and we'll maybe do one or two more sessions on it. But I wanted to, each time I'll bring a little bit more, but I think we'll start earlier in the session each time just to give a sense of all the context and where the guide is coming from. Okay, Norma, how about reading for us introduction to the first part? You're on mute, by the way.
I'd like to find it in my book. I don't see where you are.
So I'll give you the page number in our book. So if anybody has a book, this should be
Page 5.
Page 5. Yeah.
I don't have anything marked page 5.
It's
Yeah,
about in the middle of the
Turning.
book.
What?
Turning.
You have to get in about 40 pages before you
I
get.
forget it.
It's even more.
Introduction to the first part. Cause me to know the way wherein I should walk. For unto thee have I lifted my soul. Unto you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of men. Incline thine ear and hear the words of the wise, and apply thy heart unto my knowledge. The first purpose of this treatise is to explain the meanings of certain terms occurring in books of prophecy. Some of these terms are equivocal. Hence, the ignorant attribute to them only one or some of the meanings in which the term in question is used.
So, let's just pause there for 1 second. This very beginning is a little bit dense, but, what does he mean by, these sections, that there's more than one meaning to certain terms. If you're reading the Torah and you come across a place where there's more than one meaning for what that word means, then instead of thinking, what is this really saying, you're going to be stuck on one. Yeah. Go ahead.
Others are derivative terms. Hence, they attribute to them only the original meaning from which the other meaning is derived. Others are these are great words, amphibolous terms, so that at times they are believed to be univocal and at other times equivocal. It is not the purpose of this treatise to make its totality understandable to the vulgar or to beginners in speculation, nor to teach those who have not engaged in any study other than the science of the law. I mean the legalistic study of the law.
Okay, so let's stop there for a second. So the term just above there, this is just when there's terms, they're all basically, we can talk in depth, but they're all right, saying that there's some terms in the Torah. If you read the Torah carefully, and you don't even have to read the Torah carefully, I'm going to take a look in wider lens. You read things that don't always make sense, or things that don't really seem to relate to our vision of reality. And you say, well, what does this mean? If God has nostrils, what does it mean that God has nostrils? But here it's talking about terms that are used in different way in different places. And from his point of view, there's a reason for all of it, a deeper hidden meaning, if you can just come to it. And what does he mean by the last part that we read? It is not the purpose of this treatise to make its totality understandable to the vulgar or beginners in speculation, nor to teach those who have not engaged in any study other than the science of the law. I mean, the legalistic study of the law.
Well, you remember when he was talking to Joseph, and the thing we read last week, Joseph's preparation for meeting with Maimonides was that Joseph had studied astronomy, he'd studied mathematics, he'd studied all of Aristotle, etc. So people who have only studied the law, especially the legalistic study of the law, are seen as probably not available for this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not fit for the work. And that's where we began this whole session by talking about the difference between Rashi and Maimonides. Rashi would probably not be too happy with that sentence, because Rashi would see in the study of Talmud the pinnacle, while here Maimonides seems to be suggesting there are other pinnacles out there. Norma, please go ahead.
Before Norma continues, just following up on that, because Maimonides is saying that you need this knowledge, this much wider knowledge base to understand the Torah and the Talmud.
Mm-hmm.
How is this viewed in the ultra-Orthodox world, where it seems, to my understanding, where they don't put a premium, in fact, they downplay secular education?
Right. Well, it's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, all of us have had, just by going to regular schools, somewhat of an education in science, right? We've all had to take science, but in the ultra-Orthodox world, or in traditional Jewish worlds before then, your secular education would have been fairly limited. So the ultra-Orthodox, they call Maimonides the Nesher, the eagle, because of his work with the Mishneh Torah. And they say from Moses to Moses, there were none like Moses, right? Because Maimonides wrote also works of halacha, and he was such a great mind. And so what do they do with the guide? Some of them, sometimes they just ignore the guide, or they pick sections, or they say it's so obscure, or Maimonides wasn't really saying what he was saying. And I shared this last week where I many years ago was reading parts of the guide, and I came across the part of the guide that says, well, the purpose of all the laws, of all the rituals, is to apprehend God and be in union with God. But once you're there, you don't need the laws anymore. And so I took this and I showed it to one of my teachers, one of my rebbeim in yeshiva, and he was like, no, that's not what it's saying. I said, but that's what it's saying right here on the page, where he says, well, elsewhere it's saying something different. So they ignore those parts or say that it's too lofty, and that's why the book was burnt, in some places in its time. But Maimonides is celebrated in the ultra-Orthodox world, and the Mishneh Torah, his other work, is considered to be the greatest codification of Jewish law, even if it's been superseded. But the guide is studied. If you were to look up the Guide of the Perplexed online on YouTube, you would find classes taught by black hatters. But it's going to be the lens is going to be less Moses than Narbonne and more Shem Tov. It's going to be more a traditional lens. Not I want to reveal all these secrets. Though some of them will be accepted, and their vision of God is quite different than Maimonides, right? We'll get to this, but Maimonides doesn't believe that God makes miracles the way we typically think miracles. He thinks God created a world with miracles built in. The year 2000 BC, the sea will part. That was programmed into the world rather than God coming down and making it happen. So there are different views philosophically, but they dance around those. They make loops. Thanks.
For the purpose of this treatise, and of all those like it, is the science of law in its true sense. Or rather, its purpose is to give indications to a religious man for whom the validity of our law has become established in his soul and has become actual in his belief.
I changed the page.
Such a man being perfect in his religion and character, and having studied the sciences of the philosophers and came to know what they signify. The human intellect having drawn him on and led him to dwell within its province, he must have felt distressed by the externals of the law and by the meanings of the above mentioned equivocal, derivative, or ambivalous terms, as he continued to understand him by himself, or was made to understand them by others. Hence, he would remain in a state of perplexity and confusion as to whether he should follow his intellect, renounce what he knew concerning the term in question, and consequently consider that he has renounced the foundations of the law, or should he hold fast to his understanding of these terms and not let himself be drawn together with his intellect, rather turning his back on it and moving away from it, while at the same time perceiving that he had brought loss to himself and harm to his religion. He would be left with those imaginary beliefs to which he owes his fear and difficulty, and would not cease to suffer from heartache and great perplexity.
So he's saying that for those people who read the Torah and who can't just accept that God has an arm or God has, nostrils, or is confused by certain terms, and who might be feeling perplexed, this is my tradition from where I come from, and this is what I believe, but I know differently from the world I live in, and I want to be intellectually honest and bring that kind of vision to my Judaism too, and not have to choose and either give up the law, give up being a traditional Jew, or forget about these philosophical disagreements between what I think to be true and what I'm seeing, and now it just caused me a different kind of harm to myself and harm to religion in general. So it's an ancient problem, but it also has related many times to more modern people since then. Somebody else want to pick up this
Can I
treaty?
just ask a question?
Sure.
This is Judy.
Sure. Hi, Judy.
The Lubavitcher Rebbe
Mhm.
himself was an engineer, studied engineering and studied, as I would call, the sciences. And traditional ultra-Orthodox followers of his are turning their backs to that world. And in fact, those children of those brilliant children are studying in Gemara in place of a 5th grade mathematics. Am I misinterpreting this teaching with the kind of seeing the part where those of us who are not smart enough or intellectually capable enough to study mathematics don't need to study it because it's not Narishkeit, as I've heard some of them call it?
Well, that strain must have existed back then too, where the more traditional Jews thought, why are you studying anything else than Talmud and Torah and the tradition? And so, but Maimonides was firmly in the camp of believing in science and in, so just to talk a little bit about that movement within Orthodoxy, right? There's a great picture of the Lubavitch rabbi from that period when he's studying engineering, and lo and behold, he does not have a kippah on his head. But if you look at other pictures, the exact same picture in all official Lubavitch sites, there's a kippah on his head. So what happened? They photoshopped a kippah onto his head, so nobody should think, oh, he didn't have a kippah on his head at this period of his life. So well, we like to redraw history, but yes, there is a movement to go away from that within certain parts of Orthodoxy, though. There are also many places in ultra-Orthodoxy where people do not, just a few, with all of this, all these shows on Netflix happening, Unorthodox and the new series, and right, there's a lot of shows that are talking about people who are leaving Orthodoxy. The other day on my Facebook, I saw a comment by someone who identifies as Haredi and living in a Haredi ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. And he said, the world that I hear described is not the world that I know. In my neighborhood, it's true we have this more traditional lifestyle, but almost all the men I know are working, and none of our children think the world is 5,000 years old, and they love dinosaurs and know what dinosaurs are and where they came from, and love science, and have posters of the cosmos, and are just like any other child. So
my friend's granddaughter gets on a bus every day from her Haredi neighborhood to go to a more secular school.
Interesting. Yeah, exactly. But there is definitely that part of that world which is closed, and even in the modern Orthodox world, if you're really serious about your orthodoxy, there's a lot of Orthodox people when they go to university as opposed to the ultra-Orthodox who often do not go to university. Even among the modern Orthodox, there's a preference towards subjects that won't test your faith, right? They tend to choose, the law or medicine or areas which won't have you come into controversy, subjects that would cause you trouble in your belief and in your faith. And that's just where people gravitate to in university. Let's read a little bit more.
I volunteer.
Okay, thanks.
This treatise also has a second purpose, namely the explanation of very obscure parables occurring in the books of the prophets, but not explicitly identified there as such. Hence, an ignorant or heedless individual might think that they possess only an external sense, but no internal one. However, even when one who truly possesses knowledge considers these parables and interprets them according to their external meaning, he too is overtaken by great perplexity. But if we explain these parables to him, or if we draw his attention to their being parables, he will take the right road and be delivered from this perplexity. That is why I've called this treatise the Guide of the Perplexed. I do not say that this treatise will remove all difficulties for those who understand it. I do, however, say that it will remove most of the difficulties and those of the greatest moment. A sensible man thus should not demand of me or hope that when we mention a subject, we shall make a complete exposition of it, or that when we engage in the explanation of the meaning of one of the parables, we shall set forth exhaustively all that is expressed in that parable. An intelligent man would be unable to do so even by speaking directly to an interlocutor. How then could he put it down in writing without becoming a butt for every ignoramus who, thinking that he has the necessary knowledge, would let fly at him the shafts of his ignorance?
Hard hitting. Go ahead. Yeah.
Statement. Well, we've already explained in our legal compilations some general propositions concerning this subject, and we have drawn attention to these themes. Thus, we have mentioned there that the account of the beginning is identical with natural science and the account of the chariot with divine science, and have explained the rabbinic saying, the account of the chariot ought not to be taught even to one man, except if he be wise and able to understand by himself, in which case only the chapter headings may be transmitted to him. Hence, you should not ask of me here anything beyond the chapter headings. And even those are not set down in order or arranged in coherent fashion in this treatise, but rather are scattered and entangled with other subjects that are to be clarified. For my purpose is that the truths be glimpsed and then again be concealed, so as not to oppose that divine purpose which one cannot possibly oppose, and which is concealed from the vulgar among the people, those truths especially requisite for his apprehension. As he has said, the secret of the Lord is with them that fear him. Know that with regard to natural matters as well, it is impossible to give a clear exposition when teaching some of their principles as they are. For you know the saying of the sages, may their memory be blessed, the account of the beginning ought not to be taught in the presence of two men. Now, if someone explained all those matters in a book, he in effect would be teaching them to thousands of men. Hence, these matters too occur in parables in the books of prophecy. The sages, may their memories be blessed, follow the trail of these books. Likewise, have spoken of them in riddles and parables, for there is a close connection between these matters and the divine science, and they too are secrets of that divine science.
Perfect, thanks. So just a very quick clarification. We've had for long before the guide is division between what's called Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Markava, the account of the beginning or the work of the beginning and the work of the chariot. The work of the beginning is how the world was created, right? The secrets of how the world was created. And the Maaseh Merkava is based on the visions of Ezekiel. And it's really how the workings of the spiritual world as described by those visions. And so he's looking at them from his philosophical lens, saying one is natural science, i.e. what we would call science now, how the physical world works, and the other is divine science. And so he's saying that both of those, the secrets of those are, shouldn't be revealed. And so he's revealing them in this way. So let's do a little bit more. Michael, you were reading at a good pace there. So let's do a little bit more.
I'm happy to dramatize. You should not think that these great secrets are fully and completely known to anyone among us. They are not. But sometimes truth flashes out to us so that we think that it is day, and then matter and habit in their various forms conceal it, so that we find ourselves again in an obscure night, almost as we were at first. We are like someone in a very dark night over whom lightning flashes time and time again. Among us there is one for whom the lightning flashes time and time again, so that he is as always, as it were, in unceasing light. Thus night appears to him as day. That is a degree of the great one among the prophets, to whom it was said, but as for thee, stand thou here by me, and of whom it was said that the skin of his face sent forth beams, and so on. Among them there is one to whom the lightning flashes only once in the whole of his night. That is the rank of those of whom it is said, they prophesied, but they did so no more. There are others between whose lightning flashes there are greater or shorter intervals. Thereafter comes he who does not attain a degree in which his darkness is illumined by any lightning flash. It is illumined, however, by a polished body or something of that kind, stones or something else that give light in the darkness of the night. And even this small light that shines over us is not always there, but flashes and is hidden again, as if it were the flaming sword which turned every way. It is in accord with these states that the degrees of the perfect vary. As for those who never even once saw the light, but grope about in their night, of them it is said, they know not, neither do they understand. They go about in darkness. The truth, in spite of the strength of its manifestation, is entirely hidden from them, as it is said of them. And now men see not the light which is bright in the skies. They are the vulgar among the people. There is then no occasion to mention them here in this treatise. Know that whenever one...
Let's stop there. Let's stop there. So we're going to stop there for today. But here he's trying to lay out some of the basics of his view, of his philosophy. And this idea that David was talking about earlier of these flashes of understanding, of illumination. And then something that's really important that keeps coming back, the idea linking it to prophecy and who's the one whose skin on his face shone forth. That was Moses. So Moses is the greatest of all prophets, and he's the only one who was always in that unceasing light. Who could have, for him, it didn't come and go, but he was always able to apprehend fully those divine truths. So even then, fully, I'm not sure that Maimonides would say Moses was fully. But then there are other degrees. There's some you every now and then you get these little flashes, and then there's those who never get the flashes. And those are the ones that Maimonides doesn't even want to talk about.
Yeah, those are just people who wander through life unwilling or unable to learn anything or see anything.
Now, the flaming sword that he talks about, by the way, is the same flaming sword that's in, I think, it's in
Genesis.
It's in Genesis.
Mhm.
And it's the after the Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, there's this image that's put in the way to either protect the Garden of Eden from going back there, or in fact to show the Garden of Eden. That's a very important issue in this whole exposition, is that particular flaming sword. And you can read more about it in the footnote of the chapter 49 when he's talking about the same thing. There's a footnote there where the people who have translated this add the flaming sword is not the complete quote. It's the flaming sword, and there's another little piece to it for people who are interested.
So we'll have to see what Moses the Narbonne says about that too. So I'm going to go, and so next week we'll continue, and maybe we'll continue straight away. We'll start by going straight to the preface, and maybe we'll talk about other things afterwards. But I think that's how we're going to do it. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
More questions?
You have more questions? Okay,
No,
well,
I want to mull them over, and I'll read, and I'll come back next week with them fully formed.
sounds good.
All right. Have a
Thank
good
you,
week.
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.